But I can tell you, speaking to over the past 12 hours, it was about 12 athletes from Ukraine who clearly said this has made a world of difference from them. And they have justice where they want to see more justice in the future. So, yeah, it's been good.
Curling now enters the Sports Weekend spotlight.
Rob, wonderful to see you. How do you begin to explain the week that it has been?
First of all, Devin and Colleen, thanks for having me on. It was a pretty tough week, to be quite frank with you. We had the Ukrainian athletes reach out to us on Friday, a week ago, with their concerns, what was happening, and the fact that Russia and Belarus were going to the Paralympic Games, and they thought that wasn't fair. So after spending some time with them, we've decided to do an open letter. And that open letter that started with, I think it was probably around 25 signatures from Belarusian athletes to the chair of the Russian Olympic Committee Athlete Commission, expanded to hundreds of Olympians and Paralympians calling for both the IOC and the IPC to suspend Belarus and Russia from these games due to the war and the conflict that Russia's raging on Ukraine. And that's really what we did. We elevated their voice. We let them speak. And after a pretty tough 24 hours, the International Paralympic Committee had to take a U-turn and ban both Russia and Belarus from these games.
How big a surprise was it for you? I know it was the outcome you were hoping for, but to see that U-turn, how surprised were you?
Very surprised, to be quite honest. It's a little bittersweet, right? Because as an athlete organization, we advocate for athletes, and we want athletes to compete. And we had those discussions with the Ukrainian athletes. But the fact that if the Russian athletes would have been competing in Beijing, Vladimir Putin would have used every ounce of that, because Paralympic sport in Russia is huge. And he would have used every ounce of it to pretend everything was normal, to glorify these athletes and to glorify it within Russia. And that was, while you have Ukrainian athletes that we've spoken to that have to stop calls while they're in bunkers. One athlete sadly passed away in war by athlete. So it was the right decision. They're always tough decisions because you want, as I said, you want to see compete, but it was the right decision. And we were very pleased that the IPC took the principled decision.
And Rob, let's be very clear about this. And you and I were in close contact throughout all of this. This was brought on by the athletes. The responsibility was placed on the athletes. And I was here at the Ice Cube. The Latvian curling team was one of the first to publicly say, we will not take to the ice if the Russian Paralympic Committee plays. Maybe just talk about the role of the athlete voice in the sporting framework and how much louder and how much more emboldened it has been over this last bit, and the role it plays in enforcing decisions, really.
Yeah, it's a sad state of affairs that we have athletes having to constantly have to use forced change to make sport change. And, listen, the Paralympians are probably one of the most unique, amazing individual athletes and team sport athletes who really don't, they're there to play sport and they don't really take any BS because they're real and they're true. And I've spent time at the Paralympics, and it's a really unique event, much more so than the Olympics, because it's really about team and family and everyone's working together. And the fact that they grouped together to force this change, was a sign that how out of touch the Olympic movement and Paralympic movements are with athletes. One would think if you're going to make a decision of this magnitude, you would have had a little consultation. And that's been the case over the past 2 years. And the pandemic, I think, has given the athletes an opportunity to pause, to look at the landscape and realize things aren't really that great. And it started off when the IOC needed 4 weeks to postpone the Olympic Games in Tokyo. and athletes were being told to lock down in their countries, and Thomas Bach was telling everyone to train as normal.
Right.
And the athletes stood up, and within 3 days, the IOC had to make a decision to postpone the games. When it comes to Rule 50 in the IOC charter and Rule 2.1 in the Paralympic charter,
Right.
the athletes forced both those organizations to relax the rules to allow them to have freedom of expression, to talk about social or racial justice issues during press conferences. The IOC, the athletes forced the IOC to allow women to bring their babies, breastfeeding babies, to the Tokyo Olympics because they weren't going to. So constantly, athletes have been pushing and yelling and screaming, and I think that has to change because it's going to damage sport. And when we damage sport, who suffers the most? It's the athletes. And we need to move away from that forced change to have more of a partnership, a 50-50 partnership, to grow sport together. We all want to see it succeed. It's a wonderful thing, but it needs to be done in a safer, more inclusive environment that engages athletes as part of those decisions.
So is this a watershed moment? I mean, we saw during the Olympics the situation with the 15-year-old Russian figure skater, and that caused so much controversy during the games and really took away from the women's figure skating event because if she had medaled, of course, there wasn't going to be a medal ceremony. It created a lot of debate over the whole Russian doping scandal from previous years. And so is this a watershed moment where athletes have finally, and para athletes have finally found their voice, seeing that actual change happen?
I think it's building on to the continuous influence the athletes are having over the whole sport movement. And this is definitely a major contributing factor to reinforce how powerful they are and how they can be a part of the decisions. The reality is, Colleen, the biggest fear with athletes is the fear of retribution. And the only time you move yourself away from that fear of retribution when you act as a collective. And that's what we saw over the past week is Olympians, Paralympians, human rights experts, sport, the media, I mean, all addressing these issues, which were very clear to the international community, but not clear to the Paralympic Committee. And partly because the reality is the International Olympic Committee yields a lot of influence over the International Paralympic Committee. There's a lot of funding provided, and Russia yields a lot of power over sport. But the power of the collective, it may be a watershed moment. We may look at this and say, this is where this was the tipping point. Maybe not watershed, but maybe this is the tipping point.
So incredible. Rob, I know we're going to get to a birthday mention in a second, but before we get to that, maybe just how are you doing? Because you've been hearing from a lot of these athletes, and I imagine it takes an emotional toll. How are you and your team doing?
So Devin, it's you have to, every time that question's asked, it's a pause moment because we're in regular contact. We're speaking to them. We're hearing the real stories, what's happening on the ground in different parts of Ukraine, and it's hard. It's heavy, but it's also there's this feeling of contributing to something better and bigger for them, and I think that's what gave us so much strength, that we pushed forward and we stood up for them, and we weren't going to back down. And we're pleased we did that. This is just the start of the journey that we're going to be working with these athletes. So yeah, to say it wasn't heavy would be a fallacy. It has been heavy. It's been heavy, but I can tell you, speaking to over the past 12 hours, it was about 12 athletes from Ukraine who clearly said this has made a world of difference from them, and they have justice where they want to see more justice in the future. So yeah, it's been good.
Oh, you know what?
It brings the tears to my eye.
The whole world is feeling nothing but heavy over what's transpiring in Ukraine. But what about these athletes when this is over? I mean, for the para athletes that are there, where they can't go back home in a war zone.
Yeah, and this is the next step. And we've been talking to the athletes about what the next step is, and how do we recover from this? How do they recover, and what we can do to help? You know, it was interesting. I don't know if it's public yet. Maybe it is, but we've been working with the Belarusian athletes over the past 2 years who have been asking for their own National Olympic Committee to be suspended because the president of the illegitimate president, Lukashenko, has been incarcerating, has been threatening family members, has been removing people from their jobs for those athletes that are standing up against his presidency. And today they approached us and they're trying to raise, I mean, this is how heavy this is, Colleen, is they're raising money to help buy ammunition for the Belarusian athletes that are actually inside fighting for Ukraine during this war. That's heavy.
Wow.
Well, this has been so interesting. And congratulations on the work that you've been doing behind the scene to help facilitate this, because it was, to me, one of the most powerful Olympic Paralympic moments that's ever happened, because we never see change.